Commander Zethkar had served in the Galactic Defense Coalition for over 2 decades, earning his rank through countless battles against the Void Swarm. His species, the Crothari, were known throughout the galaxy as natural warriors, standing 8 feet tall with crystalline exoskeletons and, for arms capable of wielding weapons with deadly precision. They were the backbone of most military operations. Fear was not a concept that existed in Crothari culture. They understood danger, calculated risks, and made strategic retreats, but the paralyzing emotion that other species called fear was alien to them. That changed the day he was assigned to Joint Task Force Omega, a mixed-species unit tasked with defending the Outer Rim colonies from increasing Void Swarm incursions. For the first time in his career, Zethkar would be fighting alongside humans. The briefing room aboard the Coalition flagship was cramped by Crothari standards. Zethkar had to duck through the doorway and fold his towering frame into a chair designed for smaller species. Around the table sat representatives from 7 different worlds. The methodical Zinthari with their blue-scaled skin, the insectoid Vexani, clicking their mandibles in conversation, the ethereal Luminari, whose translucent bodies glowed softly, and others. At the far end of the table sat 3 humans. Zethkar studied them with professional interest. They were unremarkable by galactic standards, bipedal, averaging 6 feet in height, with no natural armor or obvious physical advantages. Their skin was a pale pink color, and they had only 2 arms and 2 eyes. Captain Sarah Chun, the human contingent leader, was even smaller than her male counterparts, barely reaching 5.5 feet. Zethkar wondered how such fragile-looking creatures had earned a place in an elite combat unit. The situation on Kepler 442b has deteriorated rapidly. Admiral Voss, a Zinthari, began the briefing. 3 days ago, long-range sensors detected a massive Void Swarm convergence in the system. The colony of New Geneva, home to 2.3 million civilians, is directly in their path. Evacuation ships can only take a fraction of the population before the swarm arrives. The holographic display showed the colony world, a blue-green planet dotted with sprawling cities. Red markers indicated the approaching swarm ships, thousands of them, like a plague of locusts moving through space. Joint Task Force Omega will establish a defensive perimeter around the planet while evacuation proceeds, the Admiral continued. Intelligence suggests we're facing a new swarm variant. Larger bioships, enhanced shielding, and what appears to be tactical coordination beyond their usual hive mind behavior. Captain Chen leaned forward, her brown eyes studying the tactical display intently. What's our timeline for civilian evacuation? Optimistically, 72 hours. Realistically, we may need a week to get everyone off-world safely. The Vexani representative, Major Klicktar, chittered nervously. 1 week? The swarm has never been held at bay for more than 48 hours in a direct engagement, which is why this mission requires our most experienced personnel, Admiral Voss replied. Each of your species brings unique capabilities to this fight. The Crothari provide heavy assault capabilities. The Zinthari offer strategic planning. The Vexani contribute rapid deployment and reconnaissance. The Luminari handle energy weapons coordination. And the humans? Zethkar noticed the slight pause before the Admiral continued. The humans provide tactical flexibility and adaptive combat strategies. After the briefing, Zethkar found himself curious about his human counterparts. He approached Captain Chun as she reviewed mission parameters on her datapad. Up close, she seemed even more fragile, her equipment looking oversized on her small frame. Captain Chun, he said, his voice a deep rumble that made nearby conversations pause. I have studied your species' military records. Your combat effectiveness ratings are adequate. But I confess I do not understand why humans are considered elite troops. Chun looked up at him, seemingly unfazed by his imposing presence. What confuses you about it, Commander? You lack natural armor, enhanced strength, or superior sensory capabilities. Your reaction times are average, your physical durability is below galactic median, and your lifespans are relatively short. By all objective measures, humans should be support personnel, not frontline fighters. A slight smile played at the corners of Chen's mouth. You know, Commander, that's exactly what the Void Swarm probably thinks too. It's usually the last mistake they make. Before Zethkar could ask what she meant, the ship's alert klaxons began blaring. The calm voice of the ship's AI filled the corridors. All personnel to battle stations. We are dropping out of hyperspace in T-15 minutes. Void Swarm forces detected on long-range sensors. The next few hours were a blur of preparation and deployment. Zethkar suited up in his massive combat armor, checking his 4 plasma rifles and heavy fusion cannon. Around him, the other species prepared in their own ways. The methodical Zinthari ran systematic equipment checks, the Vexani clustered in rapid coordination swarms, and the Luminari synchronized their energy matrices. The humans, he noticed, sat quietly. They weren't meditating like the Zinthari or buzzing with nervous energy like the Vexani. They simply sat, checking their weapons with practiced efficiency, their faces calm and focused. It was almost unsettling. When they dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442b, the tactical display painted a grim picture. The Void Swarm had arrived ahead of schedule. Thousands of dark, organic ships hung in space like a malignant tumor, already beginning their descent toward the planet. The Coalition fleet, impressive as it was, seemed tiny in comparison. All units, deploy for planetary defense. Admiral Voss's voice crackled over the comm. Priority targets are the larger bioships. Do not let them reach the surface. Zethkar's drop pod launched along with dozens of others, carrying the joint task force toward the planet's surface. Through the small viewport, he watched the space battle beginning above. Coalition ships engaged the outer edges of the swarm, their energy weapons creating brilliant flashes against the darkness. The drop pods landed in a field outside New Geneva's main spaceport. Zethkar emerged to see evacuation ships taking off every few minutes, packed with civilians fleeing the coming battle. The spaceport itself was a scene of controlled chaos, with families clutching belongings and children crying as they were separated from their homes. Omega Team, form up on me. Captain Chen's voice came through the comm as she established their defensive perimeter. We're setting up a fallback line here. When those bioships break through the orbital defense, this is where we make our stand. As they positioned their equipment and established fields of fire, Zethkar found himself paired with Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, one of Chen's subordinates. The human was even smaller than his captain, probably no more than 170 pounds, carrying what looked like inadequate equipment compared to Zethkar's heavy weapons. First time working with humans? Rodriguez asked, noticing Zethkar's appraising look. Yes, I admit, I am curious to see how your species performs in actual combat. Rodriguez chuckled, adjusting his rifle's scope. Well, you won't have to wait long to find out. Above them, the first Void Swarm bioships began breaking through the orbital defense. They fell toward the planet like burning meteors, their organic hulls glowing with re-entry heat. Each ship was the size of a city block, pulsing with malevolent life, and carrying thousands of swarm drones. As the first bioship touched down several kilometers away, Zethkar felt the ground shake beneath his feet. Through his enhanced sensors, he could see the ship's hull splitting open like a grotesque flower, disgorging wave after wave of swarm creatures. They moved like a living tide across the landscape, heading straight for the spaceport and the remaining civilians. Here they come. Chen's voice was steady over the comm. Remember, we just need to buy time for the evacuation. Every minute we hold them here saves lives. Zethkar raised his plasma rifles, targeting sensors already tracking the approaching swarm. The creatures were nightmarish, insectoid bodies the size of large dogs, with razor-sharp claws and mandibles that dripped with acidic venom. They moved with inhuman speed and coordination, flowing around obstacles like water. Contact in 30 seconds, Rodriguez called out, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. As the swarm approached, Zethkar activated his combat protocols. His Crothery nervous system flooded with combat stimulants, accelerating his reflexes and shouldering his focus. This was what his species was born for: the clarity of battle, the precise calculation of targets and trajectories. There was no fear, only purpose. The first wave hit their defensive line like a living avalanche. Zethkar's plasma rifles fired in perfectly timed sequences, each shot dropping a swarm drone with lethal precision. His 4 arms worked in harmony, 2 rifles providing covering fire while the third loaded fresh power cells, and the 4th operated his heavy cannon. Around him, the other coalition forces did their parts. Zinthari energy weapons carved through swarm ranks. Vexani rapid-fire projectiles created deadly crossfire zones, and Luminari-focused beams turned individual drones into vapor. But there were so many. For every drone they dropped, 3 more took its place. Slowly, inexorably, the swarm pressed closer to their defensive line. That's when Zethkar first noticed something strange about the humans. While he and the others focused on precise, calculated shots designed to maximize efficiency, the humans seemed to be improvising. Rodriguez suddenly broke from his position, rolling behind a shipping container as a group of drones flanked their position. Instead of falling back to a more defensible spot, he produced something Zethkar had never seen before, a small cylindrical object that he threw into the middle of the drone group. The explosion was modest by military standards, but it scattered the creatures long enough for Rodriguez to reposition and continue firing. It wasn't the explosion itself that surprised Zethkar, but the timing. Rodriguez had thrown that device before the drones had fully committed to their flanking maneuver, somehow anticipating their movement pattern. How did you know they would group there? Zethkar asked over the comm during a brief lull in the fighting. Lucky guess, Rodriguez replied, but Zethkar's sensors detected elevated stress indicators in the human's voice. Not fear, exactly, but something else. Anticipation? Excitement? The second wave hit harder than the first. More bioships had landed, disgorging fresh troops while the orbital battle continued raging above. Zethkar's ammunition was running low, and even his enhanced Crothery endurance was beginning to flag. Worse, their defensive line was being pushed back toward the spaceport itself. All units, fall back to secondary positions, Chen ordered. We're getting too close to the civilian evacuation zones. As they retreated, Zethkar found himself running beside Captain Chun. Despite being a third his size, she kept pace with his longer strides, carrying wounded equipment and covering their withdrawal with precise rifle fire. What struck him was her expression, calm, focused, but with something in her eyes he couldn't identify. Captain, he said between shots, may I ask you something? Make it quick, Commander. Do you fear the swarm? Chen glanced at him, still firing as she ran. Every day. Then, why do you fight? My species does not experience fear. We fight because it is our nature, our purpose. But, if you feel fear, why do you continue? Chen's smile was grim as she dropped behind cover at their new defensive position. Because fear isn't the opposite of courage, Commander. Fear is what makes courage possible. Before Zethkar could process that statement, the third wave hit. And, this time, something was different about the swarm's behavior. Instead of the usual mindless rush, they were coordinating, using tactical formations that reminded him uncomfortably of coalition military doctrine. Worse, the larger drones were carrying what appeared to be energy weapons, turning the battle into a deadly firefight rather than a simple target shooting exercise. They're adapting. Major Clicktar clicked nervously over the comm. The swarm has never shown this level of tactical awareness before. Which means our standard tactics won't work, Chen replied. All units, break formation. We're switching to irregular warfare protocols. What are irregular warfare protocols? Zethkar asked, confused. His military training emphasized order, coordination, and overwhelming firepower applied systematically. Watch and learn, Rodriguez said, and then did something that made Zethkar's combat systems flag him as suffering from battle psychosis. The human stood up from cover and began running directly toward the swarm line, firing as he moved. Not a tactical retreat or a calculated flanking maneuver, but a seemingly suicidal charge into overwhelming enemy numbers. Zethkar was about to call for medical support when two things happened simultaneously. Rodriguez's completely unpredictable movement drew the attention of nearly 100 drones, pulling them out of position, and Chun led the rest of the human squad in a coordinated attack on the swarm's exposed flank. It was brilliant, and terrifying, and completely insane. Rodriguez somehow survived his charge, diving into a crater created by earlier fighting and continuing to fire from cover. The distraction allowed Chen's flanking attack to succeed, breaking the swarm's formation and forcing them back. But what disturbed Zethkar most was the look in Rodriguez's eyes when he rejoined their defensive line, not the glazed stare of combat shock, but a fierce, almost predatory satisfaction. Did you just use yourself as bait? Zethkar asked. Seemed like the thing to do, Rodriguez replied, reloading his weapon with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, Zethkar realized, but from adrenaline. As the battle continued into the night, Zethkar began to understand something that troubled him. The humans weren't just fighting the swarm, they were enjoying it. Not in a sadistic way, but with a fierce joy that seemed to grow stronger as the situation became more desperate. When their ammunition ran low, they switched to improvised explosives. When those ran out, they used the environment itself as a weapon, collapsing buildings on swarm positions and turning debris into deadly projectiles. Most disturbing of all, they kept volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. When someone needed to retrieve wounded soldiers from exposed positions, it was always a human who volunteered. When they needed someone to plant charges on a bioship that had landed too close to the evacuation zone, Captain Chun led the mission personally. Why? Zethkar asked her during a brief respite, as they watched the evacuation ships continuing their desperate flights to safety. Why do you take these risks? Your species should be the most cautious, given your physical limitations. Chun was quiet for a moment, watching a swarm patrol in the distance. Because we understand something that maybe other species don't, Commander. Fear isn't just about recognizing danger. It's about understanding what you might lose. When I see those evacuation ships, I don't just see strangers escaping. I see families who won't be torn apart, children who will grow up, parents who will see their kids again. The fear of losing that. It makes you capable of anything. That night, as the humans took the watch shift, Zethkar found himself unable to enter his species' normal rest cycle. Instead, he observed his human colleagues. They sat in small groups, talking quietly, sharing stories about their homes, their families, their hopes for after the war. They laughed at things that weren't particularly funny, and showed each other pictures of loved ones on personal devices. And Zethkar began to understand that what he had mistaken for reckless bravery was actually something far more complex. The humans weren't fearless, they were terrified. They were afraid of dying, afraid of failing, afraid of letting down the people counting on them. But, instead of paralyzing them, that fear was driving them to fight harder than any Crothry warrior had ever fought. For the first time in his life, Commander Zethkar experienced something his species had no word for. As he watched the humans preparing for what might be their final battle, as he saw them checking their weapons and saying quiet goodbyes just in case, he felt a cold sensation in his chest that made his hands shake slightly. He was beginning to understand what fear meant. And tomorrow, when the final swarm assault came, he would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. Dawn came with the sound of orbital bombardment. The Void Swarm had gathered their remaining bioships for one final assault, and the Coalition fleet above was taking heavy casualties trying to stop them. Through the smoke and chaos, Zethkar could see at least 12 massive bioships descending toward the planet's surface, each one large enough to carry tens of thousands of drones. The evacuation was 70% complete, but that still left nearly 700,000 civilians at risk. The spaceport's launch schedule was running at maximum capacity, with ships taking off every 3 minutes. But it wouldn't be enough. They needed more time. Final defensive positions, everyone. Captain Chin's voice crackled over the comm, tired but steady. The human had been awake for 36 hours straight, yet she moved with the same purposeful energy she'd shown at the beginning of the battle. Intelligence estimates were facing a force of roughly 2 million drones in this final wave. Current coalition strength is approximately 800 combat personnel. Zethkar ran the numbers through his tactical processor. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even assuming optimal kill ratios, they would be overwhelmed within hours. His Crothry combat programming suggested an immediate strategic withdrawal to preserve coalition forces for future engagements. But, as he looked around at his human colleagues preparing their positions, he noticed none of them were calculating retreat routes. "Those odds don't look favorable," he said to Sergeant Rodriguez, who was methodically checking his weapons for the dozenth time. Rodriguez glanced up with that strange human expression Zethkar was beginning to recognize, part grimace, part smile. "Hell, Commander, I've had worse odds on a Friday night in Tijuana. I do not understand that reference. Point is, we're not here to win pretty. We're here to buy time for those civilians. Every minute we hold them means another ship gets away, another few hundred families stay together. That's worth dying for." The concept still puzzled Zethkar. Crothry military doctrine emphasized victory and survival. Units that suffered total casualties were considered tactical failures, regardless of their objectives. But humans seemed to approach the calculation differently. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said carefully, "yesterday you asked if I experienced fear. I said no, because my species does not have that capacity. But I find myself curious. What does fear feel like?" Rodriguez paused in his weapons check, considering the question seriously. "It's like, have you ever been really cold, Commander? Where the cold gets into your bones and makes everything hurt." Zethkar nodded. Despite their armored hides, Crothry were susceptible to temperature extremes. Fear's like that, except it's not your body that's cold, it's your soul. It makes your hands shake, your heart beat too fast, your mind race with all the things that could go wrong. Makes you want to run, hide, anything except face whatever's scaring you. That sounds unpleasant. How do you function with such sensations? Rodriguez finished loading his rifle and looked directly at Zethkar. Because being afraid means you understand what you're fighting for. When I'm scared, I think about my daughter Sophia. She's 8 years old, lives with her mother back on Earth. I haven't seen her in 2 years because of this war. When I'm really afraid, when the fear gets so bad I can barely think, I imagine her face. I imagine her growing up safe, going to school, making friends, falling in love someday. And, suddenly, being afraid doesn't matter anymore. What matters is making sure she has that chance. Before Zethkar could respond, the ground began shaking. The first bioships were landing. The final assault began differently from the previous waves. Instead of the usual chaotic rush, the swarm forces deployed in organized formations, establishing fire positions and advancing with disciplined coordination. Worse, they had air support now, flying drones that strafed coalition positions with energy weapons while providing reconnaissance for the ground forces. They've learned from our tactics, Major Kliktar observed nervously. They're using our own strategies against us. Then, we adapt, Chen replied calmly. All units, abandon prepared positions. We're switching to mobile defense. Make them chase us through the spaceport complex. What followed was unlike any battle Zethkar had ever fought. Instead of holding static positions and applying overwhelming firepower, they became ghosts in the sprawling spaceport complex. Small teams of coalition forces struck at swarm units, then melted away into the maze of buildings, vehicles, and cargo containers. It was chaotic, uncoordinated by traditional military standards, and absolutely effective. The humans, Zethkar noticed, seemed to thrive in this environment. Where other species struggled to adapt to the constantly changing tactical situation, the humans moved through the urban battlefield like they had been born to it. They used everything as weapons. Overhead cranes became improvised artillery, fuel depots became massive explosions, and even civilian vehicles were turned into guided missiles. But what truly amazed Zethkar was how they coordinated without formal command structure. When Rodriguez's team was pinned down by a flying drone, Chen appeared from a completely different direction to take it out with a shoulder-mounted missile. When Zethkar found himself surrounded by swarm ground forces, 2 human engineers he'd never met before emerged from a maintenance tunnel and led him to safety through a route they'd apparently improvised on the spot. It was as if they shared some form of collective tactical consciousness, each human somehow knowing what the others would do without explicit communication. When he asked Chen about it during a brief regrouping, her explanation was typically human in its simplicity. We think the same way, she said, reloading her weapon while keeping watch for swarm patrols. Most humans have similar survival instincts, similar ways of looking at problems. When you're fighting for your life, you don't have time to overthink things. You just do what makes sense and trust that your teammates are doing the same thing. But how do you know what makes sense to another human? Chen smiled grimly. Because we're all afraid of the same things. We all want to protect the people we care about. When you understand someone's fears, you can predict their actions pretty well. As if to demonstrate her point, an explosion echoed from across the spaceport complex, followed by Rodriguez's voice on the comm. Sorry, Captain. Had to blow the fuel depot. Swarm was trying to establish a forward base there. Good call, Chen replied without hesitation. Fall back to Sector 7. We'll link up there. How did you know he would do that? Zethkar asked. Because it's what I would have done. What any of us would have done. Sometimes fear makes you think alike. The battle raged through the morning and into the afternoon. Slowly, inevitably, the coalition forces were pushed back toward the final evacuation ships. But they had accomplished something remarkable. What should have been a 2-hour route had turned into an 8-hour running battle, buying precious time for thousands of additional civilians to escape. As the sun began setting, Zethkar found himself in what he realized would be their final defensive position, a cargo loading area near the last operational landing pad. Around him, the surviving coalition forces checked their ammunition and prepared for what everyone knew would be a suicidal last stand. Of the original 800 defenders, fewer than 200 remained combat effective. The humans, he noticed, were saying their goodbyes. Not dramatic speeches or formal military farewells, but quiet, personal moments. Rodriguez showed pictures of his daughter to a Vexenized soldier who had lost his primary weapons. Chen wrote something on a piece of paper and gave it to one of the Luminari, asking her to deliver it if she survived. 2 human privates shared what appeared to be their last rations with a wounded Zenthari. Commander Zethkar. Captain Chen approached him as he checked his own weapons. I wanted to thank you. Thank me? For what, Captain? For fighting with us. For trusting us. I know this isn't how your species normally conducts warfare, and I know our methods probably seem chaotic to you, but you stayed with us anyway." Zethkar considered her words. "Captain, may I tell you something? When this battle began, I did not understand why humans were considered elite soldiers. You seemed too fragile, too emotional, too unpredictable. But I think I am beginning to understand." "Oh, what's that?" "Fear makes you dangerous in ways that courage alone cannot. A Crothry warrior fights until victory or death because it is our nature. But a human fights until victory or death because there are things worth protecting. The first is admirable. The second is terrifying." Chin's smile was sad but genuine. "Welcome to being human, Commander." Before he could ask what she meant, the final swarm assault began. Thousands of drones poured into the cargo loading area from every direction, while flying units attacked from above. The remaining coalition forces formed a tight defensive circle around the landing pad, where the last evacuation ship was loading refugees. The battle was fierce but brief. Zethkar's plasma rifles carved through swarm ranks with methodical precision, but for every drone he dropped, 5 more took its place. Around him, his fellow defenders fell one by one. Major Kliktar was overwhelmed by flying drones. A Luminary Energy specialist disappeared under a wave of ground forces. Even his enhanced Crothry armor began showing damage from the constant attacks. That's when something extraordinary happened. As the swarm forces pressed closer to the evacuation ship, as it became clear that the defensive line would collapse within minutes, the surviving humans did something that violated every principle of military logic Zethkar had ever learned. They charged. Not a coordinated tactical advance, but a desperate, all-out assault directly into the heart of the swarm forces. Rodriguez led the way, firing his rifle until it clicked empty, then drawing a sidearm, then resorting to an improvised weapon made from a broken piece of machinery. Chun was right beside him, her small frame somehow moving through the chaos like a force of nature, clearing a path for the evacuation ship with nothing but determination and a seemingly endless supply of explosive devices. Zethkar watched in amazement as the humans fought with a ferocity that made his own species look restrained. They weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting with the desperate fury of parents protecting their children, of people who had everything to lose and nothing left to hold back. And for the first time in his life, Zethkar felt it. The cold sensation in his chest that Rodriguez had described. The racing thoughts, the shaking hands, the overwhelming awareness of everything that could go wrong. He was afraid that these brave, impossible humans would die, afraid that their sacrifice would be meaningless, afraid that he would have to watch them fall. But along with the fear came something else. Understanding. Zethkar raised his heavy cannon and charged into the swarm alongside his human comrades. Not because his tactical protocols demanded it, not because it was strategically sound, but because fear had taught him something his species had never understood. Sometimes the things worth protecting are worth dying for. The charge succeeded, barely. The evacuation ship lifted off with the last load of civilians as the coalition forces fought their desperate, holding action. But as Zethkar looked around at the aftermath, at Rodriguez bleeding from multiple wounds but still standing, at Chun helping wounded soldiers despite her own injuries, at the impossible handful of survivors who had somehow held the line against overwhelming odds, he realized something profound had changed. He was no longer just a Crothry warrior fighting alongside humans. Fear had transformed him into something new, something he didn't have words for yet. But as he helped Rodriguez to the emergency medical station, as he watched the evacuation ships disappearing into the safety of space, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He finally understood what the humans had been trying to tell him about courage, about fear, and about what it truly meant to fight for something greater than yourself. The battle was over. But Zethkar's education in humanity was just beginning. 3 months after the Battle of New Geneva, Commander Zethkar stood before the Crothry High Command Council, his crystalline exoskeleton bearing the scars of that desperate fight. The chamber was vast and austere, carved from living rock and filled with the greatest military minds of his species. Today, they had summoned him to explain something that troubled them deeply, his request to be permanently assigned to human units. Commander Zethkar, spoke Elder Vashtar, her ancient voice carrying the weight of 1,000 victories. Your combat record has been exemplary for over 2 decades. You have served the coalition with honor and distinction. Yet now you request to abandon service with your own kind in favor of these humans. Explain this decision. Zethkar stood at attention, choosing his words carefully. How could he explain to beings who had never experienced fear what it had taught him about courage? How could he describe the transformation that had occurred during those desperate hours of fighting? Honored elders, he began. I have discovered that our understanding of warfare has been incomplete. We have mastered the science of combat, but ignored its art. The humans have taught me that there is more to being a warrior than tactical superiority and physical prowess. Elder Kethmore, the council's most decorated general, leaned forward. Explain what you mean by art, Commander. Warfare is mathematics, force ratios, supply lines, strategic positioning. These humans you praise so highly were nearly wiped out at New Geneva. Their casualty rates were terrible by any rational standard. And, yet, Elder Kethmore, they achieved their objective. 700,000 civilians were evacuated safely. By Crothery doctrine, the mission should have failed within hours. Instead, it lasted 3 days and saved nearly 750,000 lives. Through reckless tactics and unnecessary sacrifice, another elder interjected. Proper strategy could have achieved the same result with fewer losses. Zethkar had expected this response. The Crothery way of war was logical, efficient, and had served them well for centuries. But, after fighting alongside humans, he had begun to see its limitations. Respectfully, I disagree, he said. I have run tactical simulations of the New Geneva scenario using pure Crothery methodology. In every simulation, we are forced to retreat within 6 hours, abandoning the civilian population to the swarm. The humans' reckless tactics were the only approach that offered any hope of success. Because they fought without regard for their own survival, Elder Vashtar observed. This is not courage, Commander. This is madness. No, Elder. It is fear. The chamber fell silent. Fear was not a concept discussed in Crothery military circles, except as a weakness to be exploited in enemies. Fear motivated every action those humans took, Zethkar continued. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of letting down those depending on them. But, instead of paralyzing them, fear drove them to fight harder than I believed possible. They improvised solutions that our tactical computers never could have calculated because desperation sparked creativity that logic alone cannot achieve. He activated his personal display, showing footage from the battle. Watch Sergeant Rodriguez's assault on the swarm command structure. By every principle we know, it was suicidal. 1 soldier against 50 drones, no support, minimal equipment. Our doctrine would classify it as a tactical error. But Rodriguez understood something our computers did not. Sometimes the impossible action is the only one your enemy won't expect. The elders watched in silence as the footage showed Rodriguez's impossible charge, his destruction of the swarm coordination node, and the confusion that followed as enemy forces lost tactical coherence at a critical moment. One lucky success does not validate reckless behavior, Elder Kethmore said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. It was not luck, Elder. I fought beside Rodriguez for 3 days. I watched him make dozens of similar decisions, each one seemingly impossible, each one ultimately successful. The humans call it thinking outside the box. They mean approaching problems without the constraints of established doctrine. Zethkar changed the display to show his own post-battle analysis. I have spent the last 3 months studying human military history. Do you know what I discovered? They have no unified martial doctrine. Their greatest victories come not from superior technology or overwhelming force, but from tactical innovations developed in the heat of battle. They adapt faster than any species I have encountered because fear forces them to constantly question their assumptions. He showed images from human historical battles, ancient conflicts where outnumbered forces used terrain and whether to defeat larger armies, modern battles where inferior technology was overcome through unconventional strategies. But, most importantly, Zethkar continued, I learned that fear creates bonds between soldiers that pure professionalism cannot match. When humans fight, they are not just protecting abstract strategic objectives. They fight for each other, for their families, for futures they may never see, but desperately want to preserve. This emotional investment makes them willing to take risks that rational calculation would reject. Elder Vashtar studied him carefully. You speak of fear and emotion as strengths, Commander. But these same qualities make humans unpredictable, unreliable. How can you trust allies whose actions are driven by irrational impulses? For this question, Zethkar had a personal answer. Because I have experienced those impulses myself, Elder. At New Geneva, for the first time in my life, I felt what humans call fear. I was afraid, afraid for my human comrades, afraid of failing the civilians depending on us, afraid of losing something precious and irreplaceable. And that fear taught me something our species has never understood. True strength comes not from the absence of fear, but from acting correctly despite being afraid. He paused, seeing the confusion on the elders' faces. I have read human literature since the battle, trying to understand their psychology. They have a saying, courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. I believe this explains their effectiveness in combat. They do not fight because they are unafraid. They fight because they are afraid of the consequences of not fighting. Elder Kethmore stood and walked to the chamber's tactical display. You are asking us to fundamentally reconsider our approach to warfare, Commander. The Crothery way has served us well for millennia. I am not asking you to abandon our strengths, Elder. Crothery discipline, tactical precision, and technological superiority remain valuable assets. But I believe we could become even more effective by incorporating human adaptability and emotional investment into our strategic thinking. And you believe the only way to learn these skills is to fight alongside humans? Yes, Elder. Fear cannot be taught in simulations or learned from tactical manuals. It can only be experienced, and humans have become masters of using fear as a weapon against itself. The elders conferred in low tones for several minutes, while Zethkar waited. Finally, Elder Vashtar spoke again. Your request troubles us, Commander. You are one of our finest officers, and we are reluctant to lose your services to human units. However, your analysis of the New Geneva engagement has merit. Perhaps there is value in understanding our allies more completely. She paused, considering her words carefully. We will approve your transfer on one condition. You will serve as a liaison officer, studying human tactics and psychology. After one standard year, you will return to brief the High Command on your findings. If your conclusions prove valuable, we may consider broader integration with human forces. Zethkar felt something he was beginning to recognize as relief, another human emotion that his species had no word for. Thank you, elders. I will not disappoint you. See that you do not, Commander. And remember, you carry the honor of our people with you. Do not let human emotionalism compromise your judgment. As Zethkar left the council chamber, he reflected on that final warning. The elders still did not understand what he had learned at New Geneva. Fear and emotion were not weaknesses to be overcome, but tools to be mastered. The humans had not succeeded despite their emotions, but because of them. 2 weeks later, he reported to his new assignment aboard the Coalition cruiser Defiance. Captain Shin met him at the docking bay, her small frame now seeming more impressive than diminutive. Sergeant Rodriguez was there too, his arm still in a regeneration sleeve from wounds suffered at New Geneva. Welcome back, Commander, Chin said with a smile. Ready for your next education in human warfare? I believe so, Captain. Though I confess, I am still learning to manage these new sensations fear has introduced to my psychology. Rodriguez laughed. Don't worry about it, sir. Fear never gets easier to handle. You just get better at using it. Using it. Sure. Fear tells you what's important, helps you prioritize threats, motivates you to find solutions you wouldn't normally consider. The trick isn't getting rid of fear. It's making fear work for you instead of against you. As they walked through the ship's corridors, Zethkar noticed something he had missed during their previous deployment. The human crew members seemed more relaxed than other species' military personnel, but also more alert. They joked and laughed during routine duties, but their eyes constantly scanned for potential problems. It was as if they existed in a state of controlled anxiety, ready to respond instantly to any crisis. Captain Chun, he said, may I ask you something personal? Shoot. At New Geneva, when you made the decision to charge into the swarm lines, were you afraid? Chun stopped walking and looked at him seriously. Terrified. I was absolutely convinced we were all going to die. Then, why did you order the charge? Because being afraid of dying is less important than being afraid of letting innocent people die. Fear isn't about avoiding risks, Commander. It's about understanding which risks are worth taking. Over the following months, as they deployed to conflict zones across the galaxy, Zethkar began to understand the full complexity of human psychology. Fear was indeed central to their nature, but it was far more sophisticated than he had initially realized. Humans experience dozens of different types of fear: fear of death, fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of shame, fear of letting others down. Each type motivated different behaviors and decision-making processes. More importantly, he learned that humans had developed elaborate social and psychological mechanisms for managing fear. They formed close emotional bonds with their comrades, creating support networks that helped individuals function despite overwhelming anxiety. They used humor to defuse tension, storytelling to process trauma, and ritual to create psychological anchors in chaotic situations. But, perhaps most remarkably, they had learned to use fear as a tactical advantage. Human commanders routinely made decisions that terrified them, precisely because such decisions would be unexpected to enemies who assumed rational actors would avoid frightening choices. Human soldiers regularly volunteered for missions they knew might kill them, because fear of letting down their comrades was stronger than fear of personal death. During a particularly intense engagement on the mining world of Kepler 622c, Zethkar experienced his own breakthrough in understanding. The coalition forces were outnumbered and outgunned by a void swarm incursion, with no hope of reinforcement for at least 48 hours. Standard Crothery doctrine called for immediate withdrawal to preserve combat strength. But, as he watched human miners, civilians with no military training, volunteering to help defend their homes, as he saw children being evacuated while their parents stayed behind to fight, Zethkar felt that familiar cold sensation in his chest. Fear, not just of death or defeat, but of failing these brave, stubborn humans who refused to abandon their homes despite impossible odds. For the first time since New Geneva, he made a decision based on fear rather than tactical logic. Instead of recommending withdrawal, he volunteered to lead a desperate assault on the swarm landing zones, hoping to buy time for a full civilian evacuation. The mission succeeded, barely. But, as he stood among the human defenders afterward, sharing in their exhausted relief and fierce joy at having saved their community, Zethkar finally understood what Captain Chen had meant when she welcomed him to being human. Fear had not made him human. Crothery physiology ensured he would always be alien to human experience. But fear had taught him to think like a human, to value what humans valued, to fight for reasons beyond duty or logic. It had shown him that sometimes the most rational decision is to act irrationally, that sometimes the best strategy is to abandon strategy entirely, and that courage without fear is merely recklessness, while courage with fear becomes something approaching nobility. When his year of service ended and he returned to brief the Crothery High Command, Zethkar brought with him more than tactical innovations and psychological insights. He brought a fundamental challenge to his species' understanding of warfare and perhaps of life itself. Honored elders, he concluded his report, I have learned that there is more to being a warrior than we ever imagined. The humans fight not just with their bodies and minds, but with their hearts and souls. They have weaponized their deepest vulnerabilities and turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. If we wish to understand war in all its complexity, we must learn to understand fear. The council chamber was silent for a long moment before Elder Vashtar spoke. And what do you recommend, Commander? That we begin training selected Crothery officers to serve with human units. Not to become human, but to learn from human approaches to conflict and adversity. Fear may be foreign to our nature, but understanding fear will make us better allies and more complete warriors. Elder Kethmore leaned forward. You believe this emotional approach to warfare has broad applications? I believe, Elder, that the humans have discovered something profound about the nature of courage itself. And I believe that any species wise enough to learn from their example will become stronger for the knowledge. Looking back, Zethkar would mark that moment as the beginning of a new era in Crothery military thinking. But, for him personally, it was simply the next step in a journey that had begun when he first fought shoulder to shoulder with humans and learned that true strength comes not from the absence of fear, but from the willingness to be afraid for something greater than yourself. The irony was not lost on him that in learning to be afraid, he had discovered a deeper form of courage than he had ever thought possible. And, in the years that followed, as Crothery and human forces worked more closely together, that lesson would prove more valuable than any tactical innovation or technological advancement. Fear, it turned out, was indeed humanity's greatest weapon. But, like all powerful weapons, it was most dangerous in the hands of those who understood how to wield it wisely.